William Wordsworth, 1770 to 1850. It was in 1797 that the new romantic movement in our literature assumed defined form, definite form. Wordsworth and Coleridge retired to the Quantock Hills, Somerset, and there formed the deliberate purpose to make literature adapted to interest mankind permanently, which they declared classic poetry could never do. Helping the two people poets was Wordsworth's sister Dorothy, with a woman's love for flowers and all beautiful things, and a woman's divine sympathy for human life, even in its lowest forms. Though a silent partner, she furnished her perhaps the largest share of the inspiration which resulted in the famous lyrical ballads of 1798. In their partnership, Coleridge was to take up the supernatural or at least romantic, while Wordsworth was to give the charm of novelty to things of everyday, while awakening the mind's attention from the lethargy of custom and directing to it to the loveliness and the wonders of the world before us. The whole spirit of their work is reflected in two poems of this remarkable little volumes. The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, which is Coleridge's masterpiece, and Lines written a few miles above Tinton Abbey, which expresses Wordsworth's poetical creed and which is one of the noblest and most significant of our poems. That the lyrical ballads attracted no attention and was particularly ignored by a public that would soon go into raptures over Byron's Childe Harold and Don John is of small consequence. Many men will hurry a mile to see skyrockets who never notice Orion and plead pleasels from them on doorsteps. Had Wordsworth and Coleridge written only this one little book, they would still be among the representative writers of the age that proclaimed that the final trump of Romanticism, life of William Wordsworth. To understand the life of him who, in Tennyson's words, uttered nothing base, it is well to read first the prelude, which records the impressions made upon Wordsworth's mind from his earliest recollection until his full manhood. In 1805, when the poem was completed, outwardly his long and uneventful life divides itself mutually into four periods: his childhood and youth in the Cumberland Hills from 1770 to 1787. Second, a period of uncertainty, of storm and stress, including his university life at Cambridge, his travels abroad, and his revolutionary experience from 1787 to 1797. A short but significant period of finding himself and his work from 1797 to 1799, a long period of retirement in the northern lake region where he was born and where for a full half century he lived so close to nature that the influence is reflected in all his poetry. When one has outlined these four periods, he has told almost all that can be told of a life which is marked not by events but largely by spiritual experiences. Wordsworth was born in 1770 at Cockermouth, Cumberland, where there went. It's almost a shock to one who knows Wordsworth only by his calm and noble poetry to read that he was a moody and violent temper. and his mother despaired of him alone among her five children. She died when he was but 8 years old, but not till she had exerted an influence which lasted all his life, so that he could remember her as the heart of all our learnings and our loves. The father died some 6 years later, and the orphan was taken in charge by relatives, who sent him to school at Hawkshead in the beautiful Lake region. Here, apparently, the unroofed school of nature attracted him more than the discipline of the classics, and he learned more eagerly from flowers and hills and stars than from his books. What one must read Wordsworth on record in the prelude to appreciate this. Three things in this book must impress even the casual reader. First, Wordsworth loves to be alone and is never lonely with nature. Second, like every other child who spends much time alone in the woods and fields, he feels the presence of some living spirit, real though unseen, and companionable though silent. Third, his impressions are exactly like our own and delightfully familiar when he tells of the long summer days spent in swimming, basking in the sun, and cautioning over the hills, or of the winter night when on his skates he chased the reflection of a star in the black ice, or of his exploring the lake in a boat and getting suddenly frightened when the world grow big and strange. In all this, he is similarly simply recalling a multitude of her own vague, happy memories of childhood. He goes out into the woods at night to tend his woodcock snares. He runs across another body's snares, follows them, finds a woodcock, coach, takes it, hurries away through the night, and then I heard among the solitary hills low breathings coming after me and sounds of undistinguishable motion. That is like a mental photograph. Any boy who has come home through the woods at night will recognize it instantly. Again, he tells us going birds nesting on the cliffs. Oh, when I have hung above the raven's nest by knots of grass and half-inch fishes in a slippery rock, but ill sustained and almost suspended by the blast, then blew a man, shouldering the naked crag. Oh, at that time, while on the perilous ridge, I hung alone. With what strange utterness did the Lord drive wind blow through my ear? The sky seemed not a sky, O earth, and with what motion moved the clouds? No one can read such records without finding his own boyhood again and his own abandoning joy of life in the poet's early impressions. The second period of Wordsworth's life begins with the university course at Cambridge in 1787. In the third book of the Prelude, we find a dispassionate account of student life with its trivial occupations, its pleasures, and general aimlessness. Wordsworth proved to be a very ordinary scholar, following his own genius rather than the curriculum and looking forward more eagerly to his vacation among the hills than to his examinations. Perhaps the most interesting thing in his life at Cambridge was his fellowship with the young political enthusiasts, whose spirit is expressed in his remarkable poem on the French Revolution, a poem which is better than a volume of history to show the hopes and ambitions that stirred all Europe in the first days of that mighty upheaval. Wordsworth made two trips to France in 1790 and 1791, seeing things chiefly through the rosy spectacles of young Oxford republications. On his second visit, he joined the Girondists or the moderate republicans, and only the discussion of his decision of his relatives who cut off his allowance and hurried him back to England, prevented his going headlong to the guillotine with the leaders of his party. Two things rapidly cooled Wordsworth's revolutionary enthusiasm and the only dramatic interest of his placed life. One was the excesses of the revolution itself and especially the execution of Louis XVI. The other was the rise of Napoleon and the slavish adulation accorded by France to this most vulgar and dangerous of tyrants. His coolness soon grew to disgust and opposition, as soon by his subsequent poems, and this brought up him the censor of Shelley, Byron, and other extremists, though it gained the friendship of Scott, who from the first had no sympathy with the revolution or with the young English enthusiasts of the decisive period of Wordsworth's life when he was living with his sister Dorothy and with Coleridge at Alfoxden we have already spoken. The importance of this decision to give himself to poetry is evident that we remember that at 30 years of age he was without money or any definite purpose, aim or occupation in life. He considered the law but confessed he had no sympathy for its contradictory precepts and practices. He considered the ministry but though strongly inclined to the church, he felt himself not good enough for the sacred office. Once he had wanted to be a soldier and serve his country but had wavered at the prospect of dying of disease in a foreign land and throwing away his life without glory or profit to anybody. An apparent accident which looks more to us like a special providence determined his course. He has taken care of a young friend, Wesley Calvert, who died of consumption and left Wordsworth here to a few £100 and to the request that he should give his life to poetry. It was this unexpected gift which enabled Wordsworth to retire from the world and follow his genius. All his life he was poor and lived in an atmosphere of plain living and high thinking. His poetry brought him along almost nothing in the way of money and rewards, and it was only by a series of happy accidents that he was enabled to continue his work. One of these accidents was he became a Tory and soon accepted the office of a distributor of stamps and was later appointed poet lieutenant by the government, which occasioned Browning's famous ill-considered poem of the Lost Leader. The last half century of Wordsworth's life, in which he retired to his beloved Lake District and lived successfully at Gracemere and Rydal Mount, remind one strong of Browning's long struggle for literary recognition. It was marked by the same steadfast purpose, the same trusted idol, the same continuous work, and the same same tardy recognition by the public. His poetry was mercilessly ridiculed by nearby or the magazine cities, who seized upon the worst of his work as its standard of judgment, and so book after book of poems appeared without meeting any success save the approval of a few royal friends. Without doubt or ambition, he continued his work, trusting to the future to recognize and approve it. His attitude here reminds one strongly of the poor old soldier whom he met in the hills, who refused to beg or to mention his long service or the neglect of the country, saying that with noble simplicity, my truth is in the God of heaven and in the eyes of him who passes me. Such work and patience are certain of them reward, and long before Wordsworth that he felt the warm sunshine of general approval. The wave of popular enthusiasm for Scott and Byron passed by as the limitations were recognized, and Wordsworth was hailed by critics as the first living poet and one of the greatest that England had ever produced. On the death of Southey, he was made poet lieutenant against his one inclination. The late excessive praise left him quite as unmoved as the first excessive neglect. The steady decline in the quality of his work is due not, as might he expected, to self-satisfaction as success, but rather to his intense conservatism, to his living too much alone and feeling test his work by the standards and judgments of other literary men. Died tranquilly in 1850 at the age of 80 years and was buried in the churchyard at Gracemere. Such is the brief outward record of the world's ter- greatest interpreter of nature's message, and only one who is acquainted with both nature and the poet can realize how inadequate is any biography. For best thing about Wordsworth must always remain unsaid. It's comfort to know that his life, noble, sincere, heroically he happy, never contradicted his message. Poetry was his life, his soul was in his all his work, and reading only by reading what he was written can we understand the man. The poetry of Wordsworth. This is often a sense of disappointment which when one reads Wordsworth for the first time. And this leads us to speak first of two difficulties which we easily prevent a just appreciation of the poet's worth. The first difficulty is in reader who is often puzzled by Wordsworth's absolute simplicity. We are so used to stage efforts in poetry, what poetry undaunt is a part to escape our nature notice. Like Wordsworth, Lucy, a violet by a mossy stone, half hidden from the eye, fair as a star when only one is shining in the sky. Wordsworth set himself to the task of freeing poetry from all its constraints of speaking the language of simple truth and portraying man and nature as they are. And in this good work, we are apt to miss the beauty, the passion, the intensity that hide themselves under his simplicity lines. The second feast with that Wordsworth is not always melodious. What he is seldom graceful and only occasionally inspired. When he is inspired, few poets can be compared with him. At other times, the bulk of his verse is so wooden and prosy that we wonder how a poet can have written it. Moreover, he is absolutely without humor, and so he often fails to see the small step that separates the sublime from the ridiculous. In no other way can we explain the idiot boy or pardon the serious absurdity of Peterwell and his graving jackets. On account of these difficulties, it is well to avoid at first the longer works and begin with the good book of selections. Poems of nature. When we read these executive shorter poems, with them noble lines that live forever in our memory, we realize that Wordsworth is greater poet of nature that our literature has produced. If we go further and study the poems that impress us, we shall find four remarkable characteristics. Wordsworth is sensitive as a barometer to every subtle change in the world about him. In the prelude, he compares himself to an airline harp which answers with harmony to every touch of the wind, and the figure is strikingly accurate as well as interesting, for there is hardly a sight or a sound from a violet to a mountain and from a bird note to the thunder of a carcajet that is not reflected in some beautiful way in Wordsworth poetry. Of all the poets who have written of nature, there is none that compares with him in the truthfulness of his representation. Burns, like Gray, is apt to ready his own emotions into natural objects so that there is more of the poet than of nature, even in the muse
mouse and mountain daisy. But Wordsworth gives you the bird and the flower, the wind and the tree and river just as they are, and is content to let them speak them own masses. No other poet ever found such abundant beauty in the common world. He had not only sight but insight, that he not only sees clearly and describes accurately, but penetrates to the heart of things and always finds some exquisite meaning that is not written on the surface. It is either to specify or to quiet lines on flowers or stars or snow or vapor. Nothing is ugly and commonplace in his world. On the contrary, there is hardly one natural phenomena which he has not glorified by pointing out some beauty that was hidden from our eyes. It is the life of nature which is everywhere recognized, not mere growth and cell changes, but sentient personal life, and the recognition of this personality in nature characteristics all the world's great poetry. In his childhood, Wordsworth regarded natural objects like streams, the hills, the flowers, even the winds as his companies, and with his mature belief that all nature is the reflection of the living God, it was inevitable that his poetry should thrill with the sense of a spirit that rolls through all things. Cowper, Burns, Keats, Tennyson, all these poets give you the outward acceptance of nature in varying degrees, but Wordsworth gives you her very life and the impression of some personal living spirit that meets and accompanies the man who goes along all through the woods and fields. We shall hardly find, even in the philosophy of Leibniz or in the nature myths of our Indians, any such impression of living nature as this poet awakens in us, as that suggests another delightful characteristic of Wordsworth poetry, namely that he seems to awaken rather than create an impression. He stirs our memory deeply so that in reading him we live once more in a vague beautiful wonderland of our own childhood. Poems of human life, such is the philosophy of Wordsworth's nature poetry. If we search now for the philosophy of human life, we shall find four more doctrines which rest upon his basal conception that man is not apart from nature but is very life of her life. In childhood, the man is sensitive as a wind, sharp to all natural influence. He is an epitome of the gladness of and the beauty of the world. Wordsworth explains the gladness and the sensitiveness to nature by the doctrine that the child comes straight from the creator of nature. Our birth is but a sleep and a forgetting. The soul that rises with us, our life's star, hearth had elsewhere is setting and cometh from afar, not in entire forgetfulness and not in utter nakedness, but trailing clouds of glory do we come from God who is our home. In his exhaustive ode, which he calls intimations of immorality from recollections of early childhood 1807. Wordsworth sums up his philosophy of childhood, and he may possibly be interpreted here to the poet Vaughan, who more than a century before had proclaimed in the retreat the same doctrine, this kinship with nature and with God, which glorifies childhood, ought to extend through a man's whole life and ennoble it. This is the teaching of Tinton Abbey, in which the best part of our life is shown to be the result of natural influence. According to Wordsworth, society and the crowded unnatural life of cities tend to weaken and pervert humanity, and a return to natural and simple living is the only remedy for human wretchedness. The natural instincts and pleasures of childhood hold the true standards of a man's happiness in this life. All artificial pleasures soon grow tiresome. The natural pleasures which a man so easily neglects in his work, and the chief means by which we may expect permanent and increasing joy. In Tinton Abbey, the rain boy ought to duty and intimidation of immorality. We see the plain teaching, but we can hardly read one of Wordsworth's pages without finding it slipped in unobtrusively like the fragrance of a wild flower. The truth of humanity, that is the common life which labors and loves and shares the general heritage of smelly smiles and tears in the only subject of permanent literary interest. Burns and early poets of the revival began the good work of showing the romantic interest of common life, and the Wordsworth continued in a Michelle and the solitary reaper to a Highland girl stepping westward. The exertion and a scope of lesser poems, the score of lesser poems, joy and sorrow, not of princes or heroes, but in wires commonality spread are the themes, and the hidden purpose of many of his poems is to show that keynote of all life is happiness, not an occasional thing, the result of chance or circumstance, but a heroic thing to be born, as one would win any other success by work and passion. To this natural philosophy of man, Wordsworth add a mystic element, the result of his own belief that in every natural object there is a reflection of the living God. Nature is everywhere transversed and illumined by spirit. Man also is a reflection of the divine spirit, and we shall never understand the emotions roused by a flower or a sunset until we learn that nature appeals through the eye of man to his inner spirit. In a world, nature must be spiritually discerned. In Tinton Abbey, the spiritual appeal of nature is expressed is almost every line, but the mystic conception of man is seen more clearly in intimations of immorality, which Emerson calls the high water mark of poetry in the 19th century. In his last splendid ode, Wordsworth adds to a spiritual interpretation of nature and man the alluring doctrine of pre-existence, which has appealed so powerfully to Hindu and Greek in turn, and which makes of human life a continuous immortal thing without end or beginning. Wordsworth's longer poems, since they contain much that is prosy and uninteresting, may well be left till after we have read the odes, sonnets, and short descriptions poems that have made him famous. As showing a certain heroic cast of Wordsworth's mind, it's interesting to learn the greater part of his work, including the prelude and the excursion, which was intended for a place in a single great poem to be called the Recuse, which should treat of nature, man, and society. The prelude, treating of the growth of a poet's mind, was to introduce the work, the home of Grasmere, which is the first book of the Recuse, was not published until 1888. Long after the poet's death, the Exertion is the second book of the Recuse, and the third was never completed. Though Wordsworth intended to include most of his shorter poems in this third part, so make an immense personal epic of a poet's life and work. It is perhaps just as well that the work remained unfinished. The rest of his work appeared in the lyrical ballads 1798 and the sonnets, odes, and lyrics of the next 10 years, though the Dudden sonnets 1820 to a Skylark 1825 and Jarrow revisited 1831 show that he retained till past 760 much of his youthful enthusiasm. In his later year, however, he perhaps wrote too much. His poetry, his prose becomes dull and unimaginative, and we miss the flashes of insight, the tender memories of childhood, and the recurrence of noble lines, each one a poem that constitutes the surprise and delight of reading Wordsworth. The outward shows of sky and earth, of hill and valley he who has viewed, and impulses of deeper birth have come to him in solitude. In common things that round us lies some random truth he can impart, the harvest of a quiet eye that broods and sleeps on his own heart.